Hello everyone, thank you for joining me for the sew along today for the very easy Vogue pattern 8909 for the joggers. I am going to make view A. I briefly went over the instructions a little bit and the type of fabrics that would be needed in my last video. Thank you for those who voted and chose this pattern. So let's get started. I'm going to tell you what we have here. So obviously we have the pattern and I have my thread to match my fabric. This is the fabric selection that I have here that I showed in my last video. And then I have my 3/4 inch elastic for the waistband. And obviously we're gonna have our pins, our snip scissors, and also I'm gonna change out my needle. I have this in my little needle case. I'm gonna change out my needle so that I can use a stretch needle because the fabric that I'm using has a little bit of stretch to it. Like I said before, this is a polyester type of fabric, but it is going to keep me warm. And I have my glasses and I have my tea. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and get the pattern out of the envelope and iron it with no steam. I want to go ahead and get all the creases out of it so that when I cut out my size, it will be cut accurately. So let's get started with that. Okay, so I'm at my ironing station and I have the pattern uncut out of the envelope and I'm going to place it face down on my ironing board. I don't want to iron the printed side and accidentally remove some of the ink of the pattern. I have my iron on delicate, low, no steam, because this is a very fine tissue paper and that will make it tear, make it moist and then it'll tear. So I'm going to go ahead and just work on these creases so that when I cut out my pattern, I get the accurate size. So I'll meet you guys over at the cutting table after I'm done ironing the creases out of this pattern. Okay, I'm at the cutting table now, and before I start cutting, I want to go ahead and double check to see which pattern pieces I will need for these joggers. And I'm going to need 5 of the 6 pieces. I need pieces 1 through 5, the front, the yoke, the back, the pocket, and then the leg band. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut out pieces 1 through 5 right now. And a lot of the times I'll just use a rotary cutter that has a dull blade on it so that I can cut it out a little bit faster. And then I'm also going to cut out size small. So the rotary cutter will help me speed up this process a little bit. This is the cutting line at the bottom of the pant leg for view A because we're going to have cuffs. So I don't need this part right here because I'm not making the view that has the full length of the leg. So I'm going to just cut right here and then work my way on up. And then as you know, for your cutting line, you'll have a different type of line depending on the size that you're cutting. And I am cutting out the size small. So I'll be following the longer dashed line for size small. You probably can't see it from here, but we have this solid line, the long dashes right here. And then over here is a different type of dash pattern. So easy for me, the line that I need is right in the middle. And in my previous video, I did mention that I would measure from the crotch down to the ankle to see if I need to lengthen or shorten the pants because we're going to do that cuff and I didn't want the pants to turn out too long for that. So I did measure and it's spot on, 25 inches. And so I am going to finish cutting this out and then we'll go ahead and pin these pieces to the fabric. Okay, I've gone ahead and finished cutting out my pattern pieces, and I cut out the circles and squares for the markings, and I've laid out the fabric, folded it in half lengthwise, laid it out, put the selvage edges together. The selvage edge is over there towards the wall, and then the fold is over here towards me. And I haven't pinned these down yet, but I did lay the pattern pieces out for right now. Now there is a layout guide that comes with the instructions, and so I'm making the size small with a 60-inch width fabric. So I was looking at the layout guide at the bottom here, and I deviated from it a little bit because my fabric might be a little wider than the 60-inch, so I was able to fit some things differently. I like to lay it out in a way that I save as much fabric as possible. I don't want to waste it. So over there towards the wall, I have pattern piece number 3, the pant leg, and then I placed pattern piece number 2. This is the yoke for the back. And then I have leg band right here, and then, and then pattern piece number 1, the other leg, and then down here I have the pocket. So with the pockets we need to cut 4 in total, and my fabric is double layered, so I need to cut this out twice so that I can have 4 pocket bags, 4 pocket bag pieces rather. So anyway, I can fit that here, cut it, and then move it over here and cut it again. So that pattern piece, we will need a total of 4. The legs, we need 2 each. And then right here, for the leg band, it states to cut 2. And then here, for the yoke, it states to cut 2. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and pin this down and cut these out, put the markings on them that are necessary, and then meet you at the sewing machine so that we can get started. Oh, you know what? I also forgot to mention that I am not going to do the drawstring. I don't like drawstrings, so I'm going to skip the drawstring. I will do the elastic and the waistband, but I'm not going to do drawstring. That's why you didn't see drawstring when I showed you everything that was needed to get going on this project. So, all right, so I'll get this cut out and then see you at the sewing machine. So now that I have this all pinned down, I wanted to hop back in here and make a couple of comments about the pattern piece placement on the fabric. So as I said before, over here is the selvage edge all the way over towards the wall. And then over here is my folded edge. Now, the arrows that you see going down the pattern pieces that says grain line, you want to place this piece in the direction of the grain, which is usually parallel to your selvage edge. You can see this line here on piece number 1. You can see it on the pocket. So I just wanted to let you guys know that it does matter how you place the pattern pieces. Excuse me. And then also the fabric that I'm using is a bit of a stretchy fabric. So let me show you here. So it has a lot of stretch from left to right. Not so much vertically, right? So when you're using a stretch fabric, you want to place the pattern pieces so that when you put that garment on, it's stretching widthwise, not lengthwise, right? So you need that stretch widthwise to get over your hips, get over your behind. If it's a top, pull it over your breast and have that extra stretch. So I just wanted to put that in there just in case you didn't know. Okay, so now we are ready to start assembling the pants. So let's go ahead and see what the instructions say for our first step. Bring this in. You guys won't be able to see the instructions from here, obviously, but you have your copy. And I just wanted to make sure to put the camera on my sewing machine as well. So let's see. Looking at the first step, number 1, it says to make the buttonhole in each front piece number 1 at the marking. The buttonhole is going to be for the drawstring. I am not going to do the drawstring, so I am going to go ahead and skip this step. If you are going to do the drawstring, you can go ahead and do that and then tune in for step number 2. But for those of you who are also going to skip the drawstring, then we'll go ahead and move on to step number 2. And it says to pin yoke number 2 to upper edge of back number 3, right sides together, matching notches and large circles. Stitch, press seam allowance toward upper back. Okay, so that's going to be piece number 2 and 3. So I'm going to grab one of my piece number 2s. And one of my piece number 3s. Okay, so piece number 3 is the one of the pant legs. I don't know if you guys can see that, but I use a piece of chalk and mark my pattern pieces on the wrong side. Because once in a while, you know, we get some that look similar. So we're going to go ahead and pin these 2 together, right sides together, matching the notches. Let's see here. So sorry for my black background. But these 2 pieces have a notch right in the center of the top edge. So use clips. And then of course we need to do this again because there is another set. So here is the other, the other piece number 3. See right there. Sorry, it's showing up backwards for you guys. And the other piece number 2. So I have both of them ready, and they said to match the notches and the dots. So you probably can't really see my dot right here. I used a peach chalk instead of white, but I'm going to match the dot from the waistband to the dot on the pants at the top corner of the pants. So just make sure that those dots are touching and that your edges are lining up. And then go ahead and clip those. So I have everything clipped here. The notches are lined up and so are the dots. So we'll get to sewing. So I'm going to be honest. I was getting ready to start sewing, right? And let me show you something. Never mind my dogs in the background, okay? But notice anything different? A little bit of backstory. So usually I use my Juki to make handbags and tote bags, and then I use my quantum stylus for apparel. And so I got ready to start sewing and everything and realized I had the wrong sewing machine set up. So I had to pause and bring down my finger and slide my Juki out of the way. And the thing that helped me remember that I had the wrong sewing machine is the fact that my Juki is a semi-industrial sewing machine. So it just does forward and back stitch. It does not do zigzag stitch. And what type of stitch do you need when you're sewing a stretch fabric? Zigzag. So anyway, here we go. Okay guys, so I set my zigzag stitch at 2.5, tested it out on some scrap fabric to see what looks good. So probably can't really see that in this brown, but it's a nice tight stitch. Then I flipped it like to try to open it, and it's pretty tight and I don't see the thread. So 2.5 works good for me. We'll be sewing at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So, all right, before my little debacle, we were about to go ahead and join piece number 2 and 3 together, the pant and the waist. So let's do that now. And we're gonna go ahead with our zigzag stitch since, well, excuse me, I am gonna go ahead with my zigzag stitch because I'm using a stretch fabric. So I'm not sure what fabric you're using. If you're using a non-stretch fabric, but a woven, you do not need zigzag. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and do that. I think I have this on turtle speed. Trying to keep my notches lined up, my edges lined up. Can you guys see this? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was pretty funny. I was all set up with the wrong machine. Guys, I even winded a full bobbin. Okay. Which means when I got out my singer, I had to wind another bobbin. So thankfully I had a nice large spool of thread. Okay. If you see me fuddling around, it's because I'm used to using my Juki lately and not my singer. So trust me, this is my machine and I've sewn on it many times before. It's just been a minute. Okay, so this is what that's going to look like. We got both of those pieces joined. The waist and the top of the pant leg. Okay, so going back to our instructions, we've joined those two pieces, pieces 2 and 3. With the right sides together, we match the notches and our circles, the large circles we stitch. Now it says press seam allowances toward upper back. Again, if you're using a woven, it's probably going to be good to go ahead and press that. You know, I can still try to press it. It's just that this is sort of, again, this is like that polyester knit. Well, let's see what impact the iron will have on it. If it will actually, you know, I can put a low steam or something, see if it'll lay it down. So I'll give it a shot. But yeah, you guys go ahead and press yours. Press the seam. It says up. Let me double check. Towards the upper back. So yes, we're pressing it up towards the waist. All right, I'm going to press this and I'll be right back. Okay, so pressing it was beneficial. So I went ahead and I pressed both units. Okay, the next thing it tells us to do is to edge stitch and top stitch. Now, and this is just for me to help me remember. When I think of edge stitching, I'm thinking that's probably the stitch that you won't see. It's the stitch that helps seams to lay down and stay out of the way. But given that we're putting this on a yoke, I think it will possibly still be seen. But what I'm going to do is leave the zigzag stitch and go back to a straight stitch. And then I'll edge stitch. I'm just going to edge stitch with the wrong side up. Okay, I increased my stitch length, and I'm not, excuse me, I'm not pulling the fabric. I'm not trying to stretch it or anything like that. I'm just going to let the machine, let the dog feeders pull it through on its own. And I think I want to go slow because I'm getting a little bit of rippling of the seam allowance, and I don't want it to over layer and clump up on me. Maybe that would have been a benefit of stitching this with the right side up, but we'll see. Just going to use these tweezers to keep my fabric down. Hopefully you guys can see this okay. And just go slow. And my straight stitch is at 3. So I'm going to back stitch. All right, let's see how this looks. Okay, so I don't know if you can see my edge stitching there. It's not very close to the edge, is it? That's all right. So it's going to be a little bit of similar to top stitch. So now I'm going to just leave it right side up, and then I'm going to use that stitch that I just made as my guide. I'm going to line up the edge of my, actually I tell you what, if I just move my needle position back to the center, and I can still use the seam here as my guide. Not this edge stitching, but the actual seam from when we joined these two pieces together. I'm going to line my presser foot, the left edge of my presser foot, up along this edge to do my top stitching. And because I have moved my needle position back to the center, it's going to provide some spacing in between the edge stitching stitch and this top stitching stitch. Back stitch. So it's kind of cool because it's also catching that seam allowance underneath and tacking it down even more. Let's see. Okay, guys, somewhere I got crooked, so it's a little wonky. I don't know if you guys can see my little wonky seams there, the two seams. 1 minute there's a certain measurement of separation, and then all of a sudden they come together super close. But you know what? It's okay. I don't mind. Hey, when I'm wearing these, folks better not be looking that close. But I will say, the next time when I do the edge stitching, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to the top side so that I can get a little closer to the seam, because I was wanting to use that zigzag as a guide and that didn't work out. But you know what? I get to try again. So let's see what happens this time. I'll show you the outcome. Okay, so I fixed the first pant leg that I edge and top stitched after I tried a different approach on the second one, and it looks better. In the sewing world, we have a tool that's our best friend that we hate to spend a lot of time with, and that's a seam ripper. I like seam rippers, but I like these better. These little snips, because the blade is so flat that it can get underneath the seam, and you can just, you know, you don't even actually have to squeeze this. You just run that stitch along the blade and it cuts it, so makes it a little easier than the seam ripper. Maybe my seam ripper is just dull. But anyway, let me show you guys how it turned out now. Looks much better. I don't know if you can see that. I'm sorry, between the pattern and the color. But basically, my top stitching and my edge stitching has an equal distance from each other. No crisscrossing or anything like that. So we're good. All right, so 30 minutes later. Now that we can move on from that, our next step, guys, stitch back to front at inner leg edge. Okay, so now that we've already did some work on pieces 2 and 3, we're now going to work with pieces 1 and 3. 1 is the front pant leg. So I marked mine with a little 1 right there. And so they said to stitch it at the inner leg. So you have yours with you, but just in case you don't, we're going to join those 2 pieces together and stitch it right there. So let me pin it at the inner leg. If I can get here. Get this. So I'm putting piece number 3 on top of piece number 1. Gonna even up these edges. So first I'm going to, I like using clips when I'm dealing with stretchy fabrics. So I just clip the bottom first, but then I'm going to go up to this notch because that definitely has to match. And then I'm going to go up to the crotch. And then go ahead and pin or clip. Use my little clips. I hate to say clip because it makes it seem like I'm telling you to get scissors and clip, but no, I'm going to say pin. Even though I'm using clips, I'll say pin. Okay. So there we are. And so now we're going to go ahead and sew this seam down. Again, we're using 5/8 inch seam allowance. I need to switch back to my zigzag stitch. Again, if you're using a woven fabric, you do not. I think I had settled on a 3.5. I'm going to hold her steady, but I think I am going to start stitching from the bottom up to the crotch area, only because you can see how pointy this is. I don't want to have this act up in my machine with this little point. So I'm going to just start from the bottom. Usually you start from the top, but I'll start from the bottom and just make sure nothing is shifting, because then I'll end up with an uneven edge. So all right, zigzag stitch, 5/8 inch seam allowance. And again, if you're doing a woven fabric, you can go ahead and back stitch at the beginning and the end. I will not, because zigzag stitch does not like that. It's not cooperating. I'll try that again. There we go. So it was 2.5 that I had settled on. 3.5 is much too wide. So we're doing 5/8 inch. Again, I'm not stretching the fabric or anything. I'm just letting the feed dog pull it through, not giving it any resistance or pushing it or anything like that. I just want to keep my edges lined up. And I'm just trying to avoid ripples. I don't know if you've ever stitched over a ripple. And I purposely have the speed set a little slower with the knit fabric and the zigzag. Just doesn't pay to go that fast. All right, now I'm getting to the crotch area here, so I'm going to give it just a little tug to make sure the two tips meet. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay, so stitch crotch seam and extension edges together, pivoting at large circle, based along center front above large circle. Let me see something here. So this is getting into the fly front, excuse me, hiccup. It's getting into the fly front area. But I want to double check something because that was only one leg and it's not mentioning the second one yet. So I feel like we should do the second one before we move on to this next part. So yeah. Let's go ahead and stitch the second leg at the leg inseam. All right, and I'll see you back after I complete that step. Okay, so now that both legs have been attached at the inseam, we're going to move on to the next step. And the next step, step number 5, says stitch crotch seam and extension edges together, pivoting at large circle, based along center front above large circle. So we're on step 5 now. And this is what they're talking about. We're going to stitch crotch together. And see that large dot right there? So that's what they're referring to. So let's go ahead and do that. Well, let's go ahead and pin it. So rather than have you wait for me, I'll come back after that's done, or actually I'll at least zoom in on this large dot and pivoting action. Okay? We're going to go ahead and stitch the crotch seam as instructed. So let's get that part going. Make sure that you line up the waist part where we did that top stitching and edge stitching, make sure those two pieces are meeting up just perfectly so that when you look at the back of your pants, you don't have one side lower or higher than the other. So let's make sure we line that up. We'll get to that part about pivoting and whatnot in a minute. And let's make sure our notches stay lined up as well. Okay, getting in the thick of it here. Reaching the halfway point. Just making sure I'm still at my 5/8 inch seam allowance here. Excuse me while I shine some light in there. It's a little dark. Okay. I'm going to cut this for a second so I can see. Okay, so, yep. I'm still on a roll there. Just want to make sure I'm staying at my 5/8 inch seam allowance. After you go over some areas where it's sticking out past the seam allowance, it's very easy to accidentally shift to a different marking. Well, let me speak for myself. It's very easy for me to shift to a different marking and start sewing a different seam allowance, so I would just want to make sure. Okay. Okay. So we're reaching the dot that was mentioned. Mine is peach, so I don't know if you can see it. Looks like you can see it. So that's where they said to pivot. So I'm just gonna go straight up to that marking and like kind of get my needle right into the middle of it. And then I'm going to pivot. And when I pivot, that should line me up on the 5/8 inch sewing line. I feel like it didn't though, so let me go back one. Let's see if that's gonna line me up. No, zigzag is tricky. I'm gonna go back one more. That's better. At this point, I don't know about you, but your lines are going to be sort of hidden for a minute. Because we are still supposed to maintain our 5/8 inch seam allowance along this fly curve. Here's where we are right here, where we just finished this part. Now we're going to go along this outer edge, or shall I say this inner stitch line. So that should still be 5/8 inch. Making sure my two pieces are still sticking together here. That's the unfortunate thing with knits. It makes you work a little harder. I love wovens. They just stay together, you know, unless you're dealing with satin or something. Okay, so continuing on with our fly flap. Okay, so there we have stitched the crotch there. We went along the fly flap because we pivoted at the large dot. And then it's saying that we need to baste up until basically baste all the way to the top. So let's go back and look at this. Baste along center, front, above, large circle. So that's what you're seeing here with the larger dash lines right here. So I'm going to go back to a straight stitch. Okay. And we're basting, so when you're basting, you're using the largest stitch that your machine can go up to. Mine can go up to a 5. So if yours is a 5, a 4, a 6, whatever you have, go ahead and switch your stitch length to that. So I move mine up to a 5. And I'm doing a straight stitch now because this is a temporary stitch. Even though this is a stretch fabric, it's temporary, it's going to be removed. So we're going to place our needle down just at that dot. I'm going to try to get, I guess, just below that point to where I pivoted is where I'm trying to get. It's kind of funny to see here because of my zigzag stitching. But okay, good enough. And so, how will I sew straight, you ask? Because our guidelines are covered by this flap. So I'm just going to pick a spot on my plate here. Or, you know what? I don't know if any of you guys have one of these magnetic guides. So hopefully you do. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stick this magnetic guide. Ooh, it's moving on its own, guys. I don't know if this is going to work. It's sliding up the plate. Okay, well, that's not going to work. Mine wants to move on its own and slide further up the plate, but that's okay. I'm just going to take note of this 1/4 inch difference that I have here on this plate so that I can sew in a straight line. Or, you know what, guys, you can also get a ruler and just draw a line. All right, so we're basting all the way to the edge. And again, I'm just paying attention to the spacing I have here at this plate, like a 1/4 inch. And that should keep me relatively straight. No back stitching, it's just the base stitch. All right, so there's my basting stitch. I don't know if you can really see it or not, but that is what we were instructed to do. Sounds like that's going to come out later. That's why we're doing the basting stitch. The crotch area. If I were you, again, I would go back to the regular stitch size right now, so that you don't accidentally start the next step in the wrong stitch. So the waistline you're doing your woven fabric, just go back to whatever stitch length you had. I'm going back to my zigzag where the flap is. So we need to give that a sort of like a reinforcement stitch. So we're going to do the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Halfway mark again. so now we have our reinforcement seam. And so after this, we need to go ahead and trim the seam allowance close to the second row of stitching. So see the 2 rows of stitching. Now we're going to trim this down, the seam allowance right here, close to that second row of stitch. So we're going to trim that. And then our next step after this is that step number 6, turn the extension toward the left front along our folded line. Press and baste across the upper edge. So let's go ahead and take care of trimming our seam allowance in the crotch first, close to our second row of stitching. Not on the flap. We're not going to do anything with the flap. So just snip and just make sure you don't cut that seam. So I'm just trying to get close to it. You don't want that anyway, because when you wear the pants, you're going to feel all of this extra seam. It's going to be uncomfortable. Okay. Almost there. Make sure you can see what I'm doing here. Keep that going. Good. Nice to get rid of all of this excess fabric right here, bulk. Okay. Almost to the flap. Okay, so I stopped just underneath the flap. Underneath the flap is further down than the dot. Well, you know what? Let me go snip to the dot just in case there. Okay. All right, so now we need to go to the iron. And it says to press, excuse me, it says to press this extension piece, I believe it said to the left front along the stitch line. Okay, so the left front, so that's funny. Looking at it, this is the left. So I'm going to press it like that. And the fold line that they're referencing, or stitch line, remember we did the basting stitches? We did those basting stitches pretty much along the fold line that we had to mark when we cut out our pattern pieces.
Oh, right.
So I pressed it to the left. I'm going to go ahead and press that. Be right back. Right there. And then the instructions say to baste stitch across the top. So we want to hold it in place with some basting stitches. So I'm going to just go back to my straight stitch. And again, I'm going to get the longest stitch length. For me, it's a 5. So I'm going to do the basting stitches. And because this basting, you don't need to backstitch. Okay. And next on our direction, step number 7, it says on outside, stitch left front along long stitching lines through all thicknesses. Okay, let's see. Left front, long stitching lines. So, I think we need to refer to the tissue pattern piece because I did not mark those. So let's take a look at the tissue piece. So these are the long stitching lines that the instructions are referring to. The 2 dashed rows of stitching. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and mark those on my pants right now because I cannot stitch that freehand. So if you forgot to do your marking, go ahead and mark it now. Or if you did a better job than I did and you marked them, go ahead and stitch those 2 lines. And it says through all thicknesses. So that flap is folded underneath, and now you're gonna pin it down with these 2 rows of stitching. So I'll come back here to the sewing machine after I do my markings for these on my fabric.